Loneliness is physical and by choice. Solitude is not loneliness. I'm around people all the time. I am by nature an introvert. So I enjoy some solitude in my life. I guess that's one of the reasons I like to hunt and fish, is for the solitude. Solitude is not loneliness. Aloneness is physical and by choice, such as solitude. But loneliness is psychological and by circumstance. Loneliness is a feeling of being cut off, unnoticed, unloved, unneeded, and even unnecessary. I read about a woman that had been married for 25 years. She came to the point where she felt like her husband no longer cared about her, so she devised a scam to see. She called home, disguised her voice, told her husband she'd been kidnapped, and it would take $50,000 for her freedom. Well, the husband evidently did care. He came up with the ransom money. However, the police discovered that she had faked her own kidnapping, put her in jail. The husband got to keep his $50,000. This lady felt no one cared. She felt unloved, unneeded, and even unnecessary. That's what loneliness is. Loneliness is no respecter of persons. It is felt by children all the way through senior adults. It is an inescapable consequence of the fall. The psalmist felt it. I found this in 102 verses 6 and 7. The psalmist wrote, "I am like a pelican of the wilderness. I am like an owl of the desert. I watch and am as a sparrow alone upon the housetop." The psalmist felt as insignificant as a small sparrow. He felt as isolated as a pelican in the wilderness or an owl in the desert. Maybe he would say, nobody gives a hoot. Now let me say that loneliness is everywhere. It is woven into every fabric of our culture. For instance, music has spoken often about loneliness. When I was a young man, there were songs like "Only the Lonely" or "Mr. Lonely." The group America sang, "This is for all the lonely people, thinking life has passed them by." Hank Williams sang about it in his song, "I'm so lonesome I could cry." Elvis Presley touched a nerve when he sang, "Are you lonesome tonight?" Even the Fab Four, the Beatles, sang, "Look at all the lonely people." Loneliness is woven into all areas of our culture. And isn't it amazing that we live in a generation where there are more people upon this earth than there's ever been, yet there are more lonely people than ever before. David Thoreau once defined city life as 1,000,000 people being lonesome together. Now, some of you might be thinking, "Preacher, big deal. So some people are lonely." Listen, friend, loneliness can cause all kinds of physical and emotional problems in a person's life. It might even affect your life or the life of someone you love. Because of loneliness, some overeat and some don't eat enough. Because of loneliness, some experience insomnia and some consume alcohol and prescription drugs and illegal drugs just to cope. Loneliness alters the brain. It raises up the blood pressure. It leads to depression and even suicide. Loneliness can attribute to terrible atrocities in our culture. I read about a man that drove his car into a cafeteria, took out a gun and killed 24 people, wounded 22 others before shooting himself. A high school acquaintance described the killer this way: he was quite a loner. He had no real friends. I just want you to know that loneliness can cause all kinds of physical and emotional and psychological problems in a person's life. And because of loneliness, you or someone you love may become a victim. Well, preacher, what is it that can be done about these serious periods of loneliness? Well, the Apostle Paul helps us here. He went through periods of loneliness in his own life, and today we're going to read about one of those periods in our text. Here he is writing his second letter to young Timothy. Paul is now older. He's in prison in Rome. He's cold. He's lonely. He wants Timothy to come and visit with him. But Paul discovers a great truth. And it's the truth that I want you to know and carry home with you today. And it is simply this truth. You may feel lonely, but you are never alone. The hymn says it so well. God is there to comfort and cheer just when we need Him the most. Now, with that introduction in place, I want you to notice two things today that really can help us with loneliness. I'm going to share with you, first of all, some causes that I see for loneliness in the text here from the Apostle Paul. And then finally, I'm going to give you what I believe to be a simple cure. Some helpful things that we all can apply into our lives to help us deal with the emotion of loneliness. You say, well, preacher, I don't have feelings of loneliness. Well, you must know someone who does. And perhaps what I'm saying today can help you help others. Number one, let's consider the causes. What causes loneliness? Well, there's some basic causes that we can learn right here from the Apostle Paul. The first cause that I see here is change. That's a bad word in a lot of people's lives, you know. Change. Paul was going through a change. Some call it the transition of life into older age. He was growing older. He couldn't do what he once did. His body didn't feel like it once did. Can anybody here identify? I read about a 90-year-old man who went to the doctor complaining with his knee hurting. He said to the doctor, I can barely walk. The doctor said, it just goes with old age. And the man said, Doc, this knee over here is just as old as this one, and it doesn't hurt at all. Have you noticed that when you get older, your secrets are safer? Even if you tell your secrets to your friends, they can't remember them. One older man said, I knew the romance was gone when I drank champagne out of the old girl's slipper and I choked on a Dr. Scholl's insert. Do you know how to tell you're getting older? Your joints are more accurate than the weatherman. Yes, you know what I'm saying. Growing older is not easy, is it? And in our text, we find the Apostle Paul in the final transition of life. Look at verse 6. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering. The time of my departure is at hand. He believes that he will either be taken by Nero the king, or he will go in old age. But death was close by. That's why he writes on in verses 7 and 8, I have fought the good fight. I've finished the race. I've kept the faith. Finally, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day. And not to me only, but also to all who loved his appearing. The changes of life can bring on loneliness, but also separation. Extended separation or times of separation from family and friends. Separation from those we love can cause loneliness. Paul, you see, was separated from many of his friends and fellow laborers. He was separated from his beloved friend Timothy. 2 times here in these verses, he tells Timothy to come. Look at verse 9. He writes, be diligent to come to me quickly. Move to verse 11. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you. Get Mark and come. There's an urgency in his voice. He wants to see them before his time is gone. Look at verse 10. He gives us some names of those who have left him. For Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world. Only Luke is with him. He's missing the fellowship of his friends and fellow laborers. He's a foreign man in a foreign prison, waiting death. The separation has caused his loneliness. Now, we live in a day of great communication. On the phone, you can FaceTime with others, you can talk to them, and you can see them at the same time all over the world. But you know, friend, as wonderful as that is, it's not like being in their presence. It's not like touching them and looking into their eyes. It's not like having that security of their presence. That's what Paul missed. He missed their presence. He missed the touch. He missed looking into their eyes. Paul didn't have anything like a phone. All he had was a letter from time to time delivered by a friend. He felt separated. He felt isolated. That can cause loneliness as well. The third cause that I see here is opposition. I found this in verse 14. He says, Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. May the Lord repay him according to his works. Paul carried the marks of the gospel upon his body. He had been attacked. Now, we don't know what Alexander had done to him. We don't know if he just slandered his name. We don't know if he attacked his reputation. We don't know if he attacked him physically. Maybe he was just spreading false news about him. We just don't know. But we do know this. It hurt Paul. And anytime there is opposition and that kind of hurt, there is loneliness. You see, when we are attacked from the outside, we tend to isolate ourselves, to withdraw into a shell. And when we isolate ourselves, we just get more lonely. Opposition can cause loneliness. And finally, rejection. When you are betrayed and abandoned, you feel lonely. That's the way Paul felt. Look at verse 16. At my first defense, no one stood with me, but all forsook me. He's speaking of his trial before Nero. No one stood with him to defend him. No friends could be found to put in a good word for him, to give a good character word or representation. I understand that we as human beings have three basic psychological needs. We need someone to love and share love. Secondly, we all need someone who understands how we feel. And thirdly, and finally, we all need to be needed or wanted. And friend, if any of these three things are missing in your life or in the life of someone you know, they are lonely. The basic needs of life are missing. That's why broken relationships are so painful. It contradicts our basic needs. We feel betrayed. We feel rejected. And that's the way Paul felt. Now, I don't believe that this list of four causes is certainly exhaustive, but there are four things that caused Paul to be lonely, and these are four things that will cause you and me to feel loneliness: change, separation, opposition, and rejection. You got those four? Well, preacher, what can we do? What kind of cures are out there? Well, I got to thinking about that, and I thought that there's some self-defeating ways to cure loneliness, and there are some successful ways of curing the loneliness. And so I thought I'd just better share both of those with the folks today. The first being the self-defeating way to cure loneliness. I want to tell you can try these ways, but they will not satisfy. The first one is being a workaholic. Boy, there's some people who spend all of their time and all of their energy working, and at night they just fall into the bed exhausted. They live a life cycle of work and eat and sleep. But friend, that kind of lifestyle will eventually destroy you mentally, emotionally, and physically. After all these years of my life being around people who are dying, I never heard one of them say, "Preacher, I wish I'd have worked more." You can try to deal with loneliness by being a workaholic, but it will not satisfy you. Another self-defeating way is by being materialistic. Some people try to fill their loneliness with things. They buy anything and everything on impulse. But folks, loneliness leaves a void that cannot be filled by the things of this world. There is nothing in this world that will satisfy your loneliness. It may prolong it, it may delay it, but it will not satisfy it. Here's another way people deal with their loneliness is immoral relationships. Some seek relief from their loneliness through sexual relationships outside marriage. Some seek relief through one-night stands, only to find the sexual satisfaction or is temporary and the pleasure does not satisfy. There are some who try alcohol, drug abuse. It accompanies this kind of lifestyle, but also it does not satisfy. But many use it. I found that they often use the drugs to cover the guilt of their behavior. Another self-defeating way of dealing with loneliness is to do nothing. Some like to just have a pity party and complain and gripe and sing, "Woe is me." Friend, that kind of lifestyle is easy, but it brings more loneliness. And I've discovered that it will only lead to bitterness and resentment. Now, I've given you what I believe are self-defeating ways of dealing with loneliness. These ways may mask the loneliness in your life. It may postpone the symptoms of your loneliness. But friend, these ways will not satisfy your loneliness. You say, "Well, preacher, what are the ways that will help me?" Let me give you what I call the successful ways of dealing with loneliness. I've learned these from Paul. The first thing is utilize your time wisely. Resist the temptation of doing nothing. Loneliness can paralyze you if you just sit around. So force yourself to do something. Force yourself to be active. Do the things you enjoy or you once enjoyed in the past. Somebody said, if life gives you lemonade, make lemonade. Or lemons, make lemonade. But I got to thinking about that one day, and then I came to this conclusion. We need to add a little bit to that. If life gives you lemons, and you can't make any lemonade, at least try to squeeze the lemon. Do something. Do something. Don't just sit there and do nothing. Do what you can do. Volunteer your time and your talents. Read, write, engage in a hobby. That's what Paul did. He didn't just sit around and do nothing. He stayed busy. Let me show you. I found it in verse 12. It says, Antiochus I have sent to Ephesus. He goes on to instruct. Verse 13, Timothy, bring that cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, and bring those books, and especially the parchments. You see, he stayed busy writing. He stayed busy as an encourager. He refused just to sit around and complain and have a pity party. He made the best of his situation. Now, this was not easy for Paul. This transition in his life was not easy, you see, because he was a go-getter. He'd rather be out there traveling than locked up in that old prison. He'd rather be out there preaching than studying and writing, but God used these days of isolation to give Paul a profound ministry of encouragement and instruction. So he utilized his time wisely. He stayed busy doing what he could. That's point number one. Number two is minimize the hurt. Minimize the hurt. Don't exaggerate or nurse or rehearse all of your loneliness over and over again. There are a lot of people who sit around and think, I am so lonely, I am so lonely, I am so lonely. Friend, if you dwell on your loneliness, you will become a bitter and resentful old person. Look at what Paul writes in verse 16. At my first defense, no one stood me. All forsake me. Look at this, what he said. May it not be charged against them. He's not bitter. He's not resentful. You know why? He's minimized the hurt. You got to play down the loneliness. Minimize the pain so you won't get angry and bitter and resentful. Here's the third one. Connect with people. If you're lonely, connect with people. And this is what you've got to understand. You've got to take the initiative to connect. You may have to force yourself, but you must connect. Get involved with a small group. Get involved with a support group. That's why I always encourage Christians to be a part of a Sunday school or small group class. There they can find encouragement. They can find help. There they can engage others. And let me just say, they can engage others even if they don't feel like it. You got to connect with people. If you isolate yourself, you will stay lonely. And here's another one. Dealing with loneliness in a successful way. Help others in need. You see, get your eyes off yourself and get them focused on others. That's what Paul did. His ministry was an outgoing ministry. Chapter 4, verse 17, he writes that all the Gentiles may hear. That was his focus. That was his purpose statement, that all the Gentiles might hear. He didn't have his eyes on himself. He had his eyes on the world, on others that needed help. Some of you will recognize the name Corrie ten Boom, the survivor of the Holocaust. I read that one time she fell in love with a young man, but he broke off the relationship, married one of her good friends. She was devastated. Nothing hurts like rejection. But when she got home, her wife's father said this, Corey, your love's been blocked, and your love has married another woman. Now, there are two things you can do with blocked love. You can dam it up on the inside and hold it all on the inside, and it will eat you up, or you can channel it to someone or something else and focus on other people's needs. And if you know the story of Corrie ten Boom, the Holocaust survivor, you know what she chose to do. She chose to focus on others. Listen to this little analogy by Tim Hansel. He said it so well. Mirrors and windows are both made of glass, but have two distinct purposes. A window allows you to look out and see the world and others, but the mirror lets you see yourself. He goes on to say, to deal with loneliness, exchange your mirror for a window. When we're lonely, we tend to build walls around ourselves. Think only of our own pain. When really, friend, we need to build a window and look out the window and minister to others. Now listen to me carefully. I must say right here that if you're a Christian, there is one more successful way of dealing with loneliness. These other ways that I've already given you, you can get from any secular psychologist of the day. But here's one that you need to hear as a Christian, and you need to apply into your life when you are lonely. You need to recognize the presence of Jesus. Verse 17 of this text. Look at what it says. But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that the message might be preached fully through me, that all the Gentiles might hear. The Lord stood with me and strengthened me. You see, when Paul felt alone, lonely, he was never alone. He recognized the presence of Jesus. Well, preacher, there's times in my life when I don't feel His presence. Well, the problem's not with Him. The problem's with you. You're not looking. You're not aware. Because He's promised to never leave you nor forsake you. He's promised to never leave you without comfort. He said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. You might feel lonely as a Christian, but you are never, ever alone. I read a story about a family that moved into a new community. On the first Sunday, they got into their car, drove to a church just a couple of blocks from their house. And on the way home, the little girl said to her parents, you know, we sure are lucky to live in the same neighborhood with God. Yes, we are. You see, He's all over your neighborhood. He's all over your house. He's not only with you, He's in you. He's always there. So, friend, you may not feel His presence all the time, but He is there. And you need to recognize His presence. Now, let me conclude. Sooner or later, you're going to have loneliness in your life. You're going to feel lonely. I love to tell the story about the preacher that got a parrot. But the parrot had a habit of bad language. He learned it from his previous owner. The preacher thought he could cure him or stop him of his language, but he just couldn't. He tried everything he knew. There was a lady in the church that had a parrot herself, a female parrot. And the pastor said to her one day, you know, I think I'm going to have to get rid of my male parrot. He just cusses all the time. Not good for a preacher to have a parrot that cusses. And the lady said, well, you know, I've got an idea. I've got my female parrot is so spiritual. She prays all the time. She quotes scripture. Why don't you bring your parrot over to my parrot's cage, and she'll have a good influence upon him, and maybe he'll change. So he did. He took the male parrot over, put it in the cage with the female parrot. The male parrot looked at the female, scooted over close to her, put his wing around her, and said, hello, Toots. And the female parrot said, thank God my prayers have been answered. Sooner or later, we all are going to have periods of loneliness in our lives. What do? We utilize our time wisely. We minimize the hurt. We minister to other people. We recognize the presence of Jesus. A widow had been alone for about 20 years. She was asked how she dealt with the loneliness in her life. And she smiled and said, whenever I feel lonely, I take out my egg timer and I set it for 5 minutes. And then I sit down and I feel sorry for myself until the bell rings. And then I get up and I smile and I get busy. And then I start to sing. I sing that old song that goes like this. I've seen the lightning flashing. I've heard the thunder roll. I've felt sin's breakers dashing, trying to conquer my soul. I've heard the voice of Jesus telling me still to fight on. He promised never to leave me alone. No, never alone. No, never alone. He promised never to leave me. Never to leave me alone. That's the message I want you to take home today. Jesus is always there. With Jesus, you may feel lonely, but you are never, ever alone. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word and its glorious truth. Apply it into our lives. May we take the practical instruction we learned from Paul and apply it into our lives. Now, Father, I realize that some of us don't deal with the emotion of loneliness as much as others. But may we understand that it's a real emotion. It can be a catastrophic emotion. It can lead to so many things: depression, suicide, tragedies in our world. May we apply what we've learned into our own lives, but also help others. As Christians, help us to help others in their loneliness. Speak to our hearts now through your word as we have the invitation. In Jesus' name, I pray. Heads bowed, eyes closed. Let me extend the invitation.